In the manga version of the Guyver, the outer casing of the Guyver unit appears to be made up of some solid metallic material, and I knew that I wanted to emulate that as closely as possible on my model. For the outside protective casing of the model, I had always planned on using some sheets of EVA foam. I took to YouTube for some inspiration and some research, and after watching several cosplay and costume building channels, I realised that the foam is actually a very, very good choice. It can be easily shaped, it can be stuck together, and it can be formed into the shapes that I wanted.
Why couldn't that all?
The first thing I needed to do was work out exactly how the outer shell was going to be covering my Guyver unit. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't have access to a printer or kind of any way of getting a nice even spacing around the unit. I initially tried to mock up some templates using some barbecue skewers and some paper. However, I tried to work out the shape and the size without any kind of measurements, and it really wasn't working for me. So I decided to scrap that idea and go back to the drawing board. I realised that if I was going to do this properly, then I would probably have to use some sort of desktop publishing software. So I went on my computer and I used a vector-based graphics program. Using the software, I then created a pattern which I printed out onto some plain paper. Carefully cutting these paper template pieces out, I then transferred the design onto some EVA foam and then cut it out to use for the model. However, because of the thickness, or lack thereof, it was far too flimsy to use as a protective casing by itself. So I decided to replace that with some thicker EVA foam. I was under the impression that the best source of EVA foam was some mats that you can buy for putting on the floor. The problem is that what I bought wasn't EVA foam. This was actually PE foam, which is completely different. The thickness was about right, but unfortunately I soon realised I wouldn't be able to use the PE foam by itself. Having done some quick tests off camera, I realised that there was a possibility that I could use the thin EVA foam on top of the PE foam if I used some contact cement to glue them together. By having the EVA foam on top, it allows me to shape and sculpt the model, and the PE foam underneath provides the rigidity that I was looking for. I feel that all is not lost with this combination. I took some time and mocked up part of the outer casing using the combination of PE and EVA foam. I must admit I was pleasantly surprised with how well it turned out. Although still quite rough, I feel that by the time I include some sanding and some filling and painting, it might look quite effective. And it's a technique that I plan on developing further. A word of warning, if you are using a contact adhesive such as this one or anything similar, then please make sure that you follow all of the safety precautions provided in the instructions. Adhesives, such as these ones, can emit toxic vapours or fumes, which can, at best, cause irritation to your breathing, and at worst, can be extremely fatal. Always make sure that you work in a well-ventilated area and use appropriate breathing apparatus, such as a gas mask or respirator. Please note that dust masks, such as this one, are designed to prevent particles from entering your lungs. However, they may not prevent you from breathing in toxic fumes. As always, enjoy making your models, but be safe at the same time. After practicing my technique off camera and giving myself a stern talking to regarding health and safety, I felt a lot more confident and forged ahead creating the foam pieces for the outer casing. Once I'd finished creating the basic outer shell, it looked awesome, but there were still some final tweaks to make. If you look closely, there are edges that don't line up, there's seams that don't match, and it looks a little bit bodged together. The urge to start hacking away at the uneven seams at this stage is very strong, which I'm a little bit concerned about. However, I do have a plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to file it all down, I'm going to fill any gaps and basically make it look all nice and neat before I do any painting. I am going to adopt a few different methods for this, including using some filler, some sanding. I'm also going to carve some away using a rotary tool and just basically play around until I get everything looking very, very neat, very tidy and ready for painting. I thought that before I started to take sharp knives, sandpaper and power tools to my carefully constructed foam pieces, I should probably have a bit of a practice, get used to the techniques and work out how it's going to work on the final pieces. During the construction, I mocked up some smaller test pieces as well, using exactly the same techniques. My plan is to use these test pieces to practice filling in any gaps, sanding it down and shaping it so that it looks as I want it. Once I've built up my confidence enough using these test pieces, I will then move on to my model and finish tidying up all of the foam pieces on the actual model itself. Another benefit of having smaller test pieces is that when it comes to the painting, I can try some techniques out first before simply diving in and applying paint straight to the model. It pretty quickly became apparent that the sandpaper and the file were both pretty useless when it came to removing excess material from the foam. The sandpaper was very poor at providing a nice clean edge on the foam, although good for preparing a surface, left the edges and the corners slightly furry, which is not a good look for a model. The file again left edges with torn corners and torn edges, which again is not what I was looking for. In stark contrast, however, the rotary tool was incredibly effective at removing large amounts of excess material from the foam. The main issue I had with the rotary tool is I found it was actually quite difficult to maintain any accuracy when trying to remove the material. In one area I actually managed to cut through to the PE foam which was underneath, something that I wasn't planning on doing. I also started to try the sealant to find out how effective that was. With a little bit of water, it went on incredibly well and provided very smooth edges. Now obviously I have to wait for this to dry in order to get a final result, but I'm feeling very confident about this so far. With regards to how I am going to be proceeding with my Guyver unit and the foam pieces for this, I do feel that a combination of the rotary tool and the decorator's cork is going to be the most effective way I can get a nice finish and a smooth surface. Better get on with it. Despite having practiced a few times on the test pieces, I was still initially quite reluctant to start carving away at the outer casing pieces. I didn't want to cause any damage after the amount of time that I'd spent building them. However, I did soon get into the flow of it, and I did realise quite quickly that using several passes of very light strokes to remove material was a lot more effective than heavier, more aggressive passes. The material comes off really nicely, and it allows me to produce very nice smooth rounded edges. Sanding using a rotary tool is incredibly messy. There is EVA dust or foam dust literally everywhere, all over the unit, all over the rotary tool, and it's all over me as well, which is one of the reasons I recommended wearing a mask. If you breathe this stuff in, it can be incredibly dangerous. Now, full disclosure, I was having a big issue with this because of my glasses. It was steaming up, so rather than using this one, I actually found a mask that I used back in 2020. I can't remember why I needed a mask in 2020, but I did. And obviously I was wearing this instead, which just reduced the steaming up on my glasses. So now all I need to do is tidy up, get rid of all of the dust particles off my rotary tool, my worktop, and all of these pieces here as well. Probably take a shower, and then I need to get on with filling everything so that I can make all of the edges and gaps nice and smooth for painting. Once I'd actually finished sanding, I then took the pieces indoors to use the filler. Taking the pieces inside actually gave my daughter and I a little bit of bonding time when we both worked together doing the filling of the gaps.
Better not harden, because if this hardens, it's all on my hand.
I must admit, now that they have been sanded down and smoothed down, they look a lot better than they did. And I can't wait to get them painted. With the inside of the Guyver unit now sorted, I wanted to focus on the outer casing details. The design includes grooves that runs down the middle of the larger casing pieces and a small indent as well. I wanted to replicate these grooves and indents in the foam before painting, so I decided to once again try some techniques on my small test pieces. Using my rotary tool, I first started to carve out a groove in one of the pieces. I had seen several YouTube videos on how to create details in EVA foam, and a lot of them recommended applying heat to help any grooves expand and open up. So I decided to try using a naked flame. The results weren't wonderful, as some of the foam actually melted slightly. I then decided to try using a scalpel to carve a groove into the foam. I felt this looked a lot neater, but still wasn't exactly as I wanted. I decided that the scalpel would be a good place to start, and then I could use the engraving attachments on my rotary tool to provide the depth and gap that I was looking for. So I set to work carving grooves in my foam pieces. I took my time and used several different attachments until I had managed to remove the indents and create the grooves as I wanted. I then applied more heat, this time being a lot more careful to try and avoid burning the foam. Now all I needed to do was paint the model. Before painting the foam pieces, I wanted to apply a mixture of 50% PVA and 50% water to seal all of the foam. I simply mixed it up in a large tub and then applied it fairly generously using a paintbrush. and then left it to dry, and then I could paint over it with the spray paint. When it comes to painting the outer casing, I have a couple of colour choices in mind. One of them is a midnight blue, which is a spray paint, and I also plan on using a metallic blue, which is a model paint. I am planning on using the Tamiya paint on top of any other paint that I use. I have done a quick test on top of a midnight blue, and as you can see, the metallic properties make this a very nice finish, which I think would work really well as the outer casing of the Guyver unit. The first step was to paint the base coat onto the foam. Using the midnight blue spray paint, I coated one of the larger foam casing pieces. The paint coverage was impressive and made easy work turning the blue foam blue. As I continued to paint the second piece, however, I noticed a difference in the textures between where the foam was bare and where the filler had been applied. It was then that I decided I should possibly use the grey primer on the foam pieces as well to try and eliminate any difference in texture between the foam and the filler. The grey primer has certainly helped a little bit, but it's far from ideal. There is still a clear difference in the textures between where the filler has been applied and where the foam is just bare. I was kind of hoping that the PVA and water mixture would kind of cover up and seal it and make it all fairly uniform, but unfortunately I think I was putting too much hope into that method. I came to the conclusion that if I wanted a smooth, uniform finish, the best way would be to apply filler over the entire surface of the foam. To make it easier, I watered down some of the cork I had previously used and started to smooth it over the foam pieces. Once dried, the texture was much more consistent. I then gave the pieces a coat of primer before repainting them again with the midnight blue spray paint. Overall, I feel that the coat of filler over the entire foam has certainly improved the texture. If nothing else, it has certainly given a consistent finish to which I can apply the final coat of metallic blue paint to. Once the midnight blue spray paint had dried, it was then time to apply the Tamiya metallic paint over the top. I set up a temporary spray booth in my kitchen, mixed up some metallic blue paint and thinner, and started to apply it with my airbrush. Even though the paintbrush was applying a fairly good coverage, it didn't really give me the effect I was looking for. I was hoping for something a bit more reflective. However, the paint that was being applied looked a bit dull. I decided to switch tactics once again, and instead of using the airbrush, I turned to a brush to apply the paint instead. The metallic effect appeared much better using this technique instead. I pretty quickly discovered that by using a stippling effect with the metallic paint, I could achieve a worn and weathered look with several shades and variations appearing with very little effort. I must admit I loved this look. I always imagined that a Guyver unit, forged at the beginning of time and having travelled across the vastness of the entire universe, would probably end up a little bit beat up and worn by the time it arrived on Earth. So this effect was absolutely spot on to what I was looking for. In fact, it looked even better than I had originally hoped. One of the things I realised that I need to finish is one of the larger outer casing pieces. The piece that I've overlooked still has the texture of the foam showing through, which just doesn't match the other two larger pieces. The first thing I did was quickly remove it from the unit. I had only pinned it in place temporarily. I then mixed up a batch of decorator's cork and some water, mixed it all together and then smeared it all over the piece of foam. Now, the plan wasn't to fill in any of the gaps, it was just simply to make sure that the outer casing looks nice and smooth when it dries. Once it had all dried, I then repainted it using the Midnight Blue spray paint before applying the Tamiya metallic blue paint with a paintbrush in the same method I'd used before. And now everything matches up lovely.